we're about to begin. Good afternoon. My name is David Pullins. I'm the Jayne Wrightsman Curator in the Department of European Paintings. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program with special guests Debbie Millman and Cy Gavin. Our prompt is the current installation entitled Ecologies of Painting, which is drawn entirely from the Met's permanent collection. We'd like to thank the generous support of the fund established in honor of Pearl Ehrlich and the Sherman Fairchild Foundation for making today's program possible. In a moment, you'll hear from my co-curator, Anna-Claire Stinebring, who's just here with me, assistant curator in European Paintings, about the questions that motivated the project that is behind today. But first, I wanted to situate this dialogue, both our project that we've been working on and then what you'll be hearing here on the stage, within this larger series of conversations that came out of Look Again, which was the reopening in 2023 of a suite of 45 galleries devoted to European painting, made between 1300 and 1800, found at the top of the stairs in this familiar vista. This was a once-in-a-generation opportunity to consider this 150-year-old collection anew, taking seriously questions of increasing urgency to our public, but in a way that was historically responsible and true to the objects in our care. We've asked questions about gender, global trade and colonialism, race and religion, as well as about how the past informs the present, when, for example, 20th century artists like Picasso or Max Beckmann mined the European tradition for inspiration. Throughout this project, we have benefited from the incredible breadth of the Met's encyclopedic holdings and the generosity of our colleagues across the museum. Within our reinstallation, within those 45 galleries, a key space which I encourage you to continue to watch in the future, is endowed by Constance and Walter Burke with a mandate for us, the curators, to do regular rotations in that space around a given theme. You see it here when we reopened in 2023, when it was devoted to images of the artist's studio, this kind of very meta project of thinking about art-making practice, and it was anchored at that point by Kerry James Marshall's great 2014 painting there on the left, untitled Studio, a reminder that living artists have always been part of the Met's DNA. Here you see the gallery as it is now, and I encourage you this afternoon to go have a look if you haven't already seen it. I think of this space, the Burke Gallery, as a kind of incubator, a place for curators to experiment with our most fundamental activity, that is, the physical juxtaposition and combination of works of art. I can assure you that no matter how many times you use a mock-up or something on your computer, until two works are hanging side by side, is it possible to predict what the full potential of those combinations might mean to understand the past and the present. You add a third work, a fourth work, and you have a whole conversation, alive with the harmonies and also the contradictions, insights, and inspirations that we hope you will find in Ecologies of Painting.
On view through January 2027, Ecologies of Painting pairs some of our department's most beloved works with lesser-known paintings in our collection, dating from around 1525 to 1775. The gallery is anchored by two works considered milestones in the history of landscape painting: the Netherlandish artist Peter Bruegel the Elder's Harvesters from 1565, seen at far left here, and the French painter Nicolas Poussin's Blind Orion Searching for the Rising Sun from 1658 at far right, which face each other from the center of adjacent walls. Why look at early modern depictions of nature and natural resources now, you might ask? What relevance does historical art have to contemporary art, culture, and environmental concerns? In a 2021 essay on climate change, Riding the Blinds, Maggie Nelson ends with a commitment to a practice of temporal abundance, drawing on the work of poet and philosopher Denise Riley. In this formulation, past, present, and future inform one another. Debbie Millman likewise writes in the 2025 Love Letter to a Garden of growing, quote, a mindset of abundance over scarcity. She compared seeds to the universe before the Big Bang, quote, tiny and densely packed with their entire existence. Cy Gavin's practice engages a range of temporal and geographic scales. He's spoken of gardening as a medium like painting, fostering a new relationship with time and creating space, both personal and political. In developing the gallery, David and I had three main priorities. First, we sought to foreground the painting materials that continue to have lives of their own. For example, flax provides the linen support and linseed oil binding agent for pigments in the oil on canvas works on view. The oil medium allows for the exquisite naturalism that we find in Bartolomeo Cavarozzi's immersive study with fruits and birds at life size, which encapsulates the close relationship between art and science in the 17th century. Second, the installation charts a broad societal shift over the period covered from appreciations of humanity's embeddedness in nature, with nature by turns viewed as sacred, as an artist, and as a trickster, towards assertions of human dominance over nature. We examine the artifice of naturalistic, that is, realistic, depictions, including many of the enticing landscapes and still lives on view. We consider Franz Post's Brazilian landscape for what it omits, namely the specificity of indigenous Brazilian communities and concrete references to the basis of Dutch colonial wealth in the enslavement of African people and their forced labor on plantations. In Bruegel's Harvesters, which hangs side by side with the Post, we draw out the complexity of Bruegel's depiction of labor in a landscape that can otherwise feel exclusively like a slice of lazy summer life, especially at the end of a long New York winter. Our experience of the peasants scything wheat, gleaning apples, and resting in the noonday heat is shifted once we learn that it was created as part of a cycle of the seasons to decorate an Antwerp financier's suburban villa. Bruegel's rendering is sympathetic, yet it glosses over the hard work of the harvest. Standing in front of the scene's heavy summer heat, you also would not guess that it was created during a period of global cooling known as the Little Ice Age, which scholars have argued was caused in part by human interventions, namely environmental changes in the Americas wrought by early European colonialism. Yet, as close study of Bruegel's Harvesters makes clear, the artworks in Ecologies of Painting are not monolithic or exclusively normative. They include details both playful and unruly, surprising and generative, that can offer entry points for solace, resilience, and creativity. In Bruegel's scene, we discover this with the skinny dipping monks in the background, or the graceful rhyming of a laboring woman's body with the shape of wheat she bends to gather.
Our final goal of those three in this installation was to clarify how this installation, this group of works, differed from simply a gallery of landscape painting. While the term landscape implies a stage for human actors, the term ecologies, as we're using it here, highlights how we cannot exist outside of natural ecosystems, how we are inextricably linked to and interdependent on a totality of animals, plants, insects, microorganisms, gases, and minerals. Human and non-human histories are intertwined, regardless of whether that entanglement is being acknowledged. Poussin's Blind Orion provides the second anchor with the Bruegel in the space. Poussin mobilized personifications of natural elements, a long-standing means of talking about or coming to terms with nature, through an astute reflection on the interconnectedness, a kind of ecosystem before the advent of the term. In this image, the warm sun pulls water through these vaporous trails there at the right across the landscape in order to form rain clouds that will rehydrate the soil and nourish life. No single element in this perpetual cycle can be understood in isolation or altered without consequence to the other components, with humans here as comparatively small actors in a confluence of life forces. This afternoon, we will be hearing more about the exploration of nature as a source of inspiration with our speakers, Cy Gavin and Debbie Millman. Having just set the stage for today's conversation with a look at works across several centuries, it's a thrill to hear perspectives from two influential voices engaging this topic today. It's my pleasure to share a bit more about our speakers. Cy Gavin's monumental paintings, as you see here, are embedded within a deep history of European and American landscape, yet they propose something profoundly new and timely, offering us interpretations of sight that have been shaped over time by human intervention and geological or cosmic phenomena. His work is part of many institutional collections today, and his untitled Paths Crossing Blue, which you see here, entered the Met in 2023. Debbie Millman is an author, educator, designer, and curator whose success as a podcast host will be familiar to many of you, notably in her long-running, award-winning podcast Design Matters, where she has thoughtfully interviewed the artists and thinkers who are addressing some of the most pressing questions of contemporary culture. She's the author of 8 books, including the poignant Love Letter to a Garden, from which you've just heard. We are enormously grateful to both of them for joining us today. Please join me in welcoming Cy and Debbie to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful afternoon in New York City. Cy, I understand that you, as you were growing up, were an avid birder.
That's true.
Tell us more about that. I understand that you learned more than 200 bird songs?
I did. Calls as well. Birds have like flight, migratory, mating calls, and songs, some of them. So I was a person who started this group in my high school, Envirothon, which is a kind of state-run academic team. And yeah, like I was a specialist in bird calls and stuff.
And I understand that your team, this Envirothon, you competed with your classmates, no, against your classmates, to test your knowledge about soil, forestry, wildlife, aquatic ecology in a national decathlon.
Yeah, it was, we went to states. We didn't win states, but
You didn't win?
No,
Ah.
but we were incredibly good.
And I believe that you learned much of this information during long family car rides in the countryside. Where were you and your family traveling to?
My family were Jehovah's Witnesses, so they would go knocking door to door. That in the rural setting means driving around for hours, and that's what we did. But it was really great because actually it meant that I could bring books with me and read in the car, and and put me in spaces where I would have opportunities to observe birds, and that made it actually engaging for me.
Do you still remember the bird calls?
Many, yeah. I do. I moved to California where there was a whole other set of things to learn, so I sort of lost a little bit there, but so.
While you were in the car, you and your sister were also sketching and reading, and your parents also often dropped you off at the Donora Public Library, where you spent long days exploring the stacks and rows of books. Is that where you first became aware of the artwork of the old masters?
100%, and kind of in an ill-advised way, my very overprotective parents only allowed myself and my sister to go unattended to the library. And so it gave access to all of the things we had curiosity about, and also luckily gave us access to people who were volunteers there who were sort of surrogate parents, for me at least, and who took an interest in what I was doing and suggested books and ordered them from the interlibrary loan system, and yeah.
What first inspired you to begin copying the old masters?
I mean, I think it was really just, I wasn't allowed to do anything. So I just went to the DIY section and would take out books about making all kinds of things. So I dabbled with all kinds of things that were there because it was a way of getting an education for free. And where I grew up, it's very much like the education is about football and not an education. So to have the library really like more than supplemented an education, actually provided it. And and it was also a place where I could have sort of unobserved space and time to read books that would not have been allowed in my house. So.
You said you initially liked drawing when you were a kid because it was a skill where you could readily notice your improvement.
For sure.
Did anyone in your family at that time recognize that you had artistic talent?
I think there's a difference between talent and skill. I think that's,
Talk about wait, there's a difference between talent and skill?
For sure.
Tell us about that.
I mean, I think I'm distrustful a bit that talent exists. I mean, I hear it all the time, but I don't know what that means for myself, at least. I think that I had a life that was conducive to a certain kind of attention being paid to things because, as I said, I wasn't allowed to do very much, so it concentrated my attention on what I could, and it fostered like an imagination that was maybe a sort of like a escape hatch. But when I say there's a difference between skill and talent in my case is that it was very easy to, for people in my family, maybe and other people too, to say you're talented because you have drawn this thing that looks like that thing from observation or by copying it. But that one sort of removed them from that equation. It meant that you were special, you could do this, and we can't. And I remember very distinctly being a young person, and all of my friends drew, and they all drew all the time, and they drew well. And then at some point, people told them that they were good at writing, or that they were good at wrestling, or whatever. And then they became people who looked at me and said that you're talented. So for me, it felt like an inadequate explanation for something. But I also think like whenever I would draw, what I really remember and what was gratifying about it and it was that it was, as I said, like a thing that the muscles of your hands are used for drawing, for writing as well. So it was something that I could say like this week I could do something that I couldn't do literally 2 weeks ago. And
so it's evidence.
Yeah, compared to say like trying to learn an instrument, which I tried to do as well. So by comparison, it was much more like immediate gratification to be able to create something that would be a gift for someone and also that would distinguish me in a way that would give me attention and make people feel that I had value in a society that otherwise probably didn't see that value.
You've described your artwork at that time, some of which we can see here, as a kind of coded communication.
For sure.
What were you trying to communicate that couldn't be said out loud?
Not in these things so much. I mean, this is a very weird thing to show, and I'm showing it. These are paintings that I made when I was in high school, and the first oil painting I made is this weird self-portrait with a bird on the shoulder. I had sort of two sets of sketchbooks. I had no bedroom door, like, this is not TMI, but like there was no sense of privacy in my youth, and it became very apparent that I had, my father would rifle through every sketchbook I had, copying them and taking them to the church. And
Why?
It was dangerous to them somehow. But when I realized that there was this kind of like power in that, which was more than I had otherwise, it was something that I obviously like played with. So I could have basically two sketchbooks, and one would be like the one I knew that they were going to find, and then one that was not.
So you hid that one?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure, yeah.
But none of that work is here. The hidden work is
It was a
still
slide
hidden?
I took out, but those were drawings. These are paintings. So. But under these, I included this because I think probably our conversation will go to a place where it talks about the act of painting, and I think these are really like illuminated drawings more than paintings. And that was when you look at a book that you get from the library that says how to paint, that is what they tell you to do. And also when you look at, Titian or something, like up close, you see that there is actually like a chalk drawing under it or a drawing. And so I thought that is how a painting had to be made. And So the idea of painting felt inextricable to drawing, and I don't feel that way now, but I back then did.
You loved going to the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, but couldn't afford the $13 entrance fee. And I understand you found a way to sneak in.
Yeah, I was hesitant to talk about that because I didn't want them to close it up, but there's multiple ways. But now,
Well, you don't have to tell us where it is exactly if it's still there.
now I'm on the board of that museum, and it's it's still an issue, actually. But it's the library in the basement,
And
through the stacks.
What did that experience teach you about access to art? And is that something you're bringing to the museum now that you're on the board?
That's the number one question. I mean, I wanted to be in the museum, so I made it a point to get in there. I'm sure that other people would want to be in the museum, but I'm also sure that many people wouldn't. And I think that that curiosity to go into a museum has to people have to encounter that. And what was unique and I think really lucky about my experience having that be the museum I would go to was that it was also the Natural History Museum, and Carnegie funded a lot of excavations for dinosaur bones. So I thought all museums were this kind of mix of an active academic space and also collecting art from wherever, and also relics from other cultures.
Once you figured out how to get into the museum, you were there all the time. And I believe that you also had a teacher in high school who believed you had talent or skill. And she would meet you in the mornings before class at school, and you'd bring your paintings in garbage bags, and she'd give you feedback. What kinds of things was she telling you about your work?
Yeah, I mean, I brought that. This is a copy of a detail from a Rembrandt painting called Dead Peacocks. I was copying paintings that I saw in the world and in books, mostly, and they were all 16 by 20 because Michaels would have 2 per sales, and that's what I could afford. It was $5 for 2.
And they always had the good coupons.
And they do have the coupons. And so I would get them when they would be on sale, and then was very afraid of just making something that I wasn't proud of because it was costly, relatively speaking. And those paintings were originally on using just hobbyist paint, 50-cent tubes from Joanne Fabrics, which I really like actually, and I still use that paint now because it has a lot of chalk and it's very absorptive rather, and so it has a matte finish and is also affordable, so you can work with it without feeling sensitive about losing stuff. But I'd bring paintings into her, and she would just sort of give her opinion about them, and or challenge me to. I remember one moment she would challenge me to be like, "Well, you make all these paintings you're showing me have a certain kind of point of view. What happens when you work larger? Where would that point of view? Will it expand the painting as if you grab the corners of it and drew it out, or would you clutter it up with the same scale of activity inside that larger painting?" And since I couldn't access, larger canvases, she had canvases people had left from years past, and I would have to, sand them down and paint over them. And they also left oil paint, and oil paint was way beyond accessibility. So, that was incredibly important for me to have a person who was just carving out 5 minutes to do that.
One of the masterpieces in the Ecologies of Painting exhibition here at the Met that we've been hearing about from the curators is Peter Bruegel's 1565 painting, Harvesters. And you've said that first seeing Bruegel's work at that time of your life was life-changing.
Yeah,
In
I think
what way? What did it inspire you? How did you feel when you saw it?
not Bruegel alone, but I think more than Bruegel, Van der Weyden, I think Van Eyck's, Bosch. Because oil paint was, made in these places, it's like a new moment in painting, and it was very fascinating to see the kind of intricacy of the way that they were made, in composition, but also in loading them with data. And it wasn't, to contrast that with, say, like a courtly image, it wasn't seemingly meant to serve any one person. It felt like it was more for an audience, not one person, or one religious entity. And they were fun to look at. So like, yeah, I would go to art school, like many, I guess, have like a homeroom sort of thing. And you could go to the library in the morning, so I would go and like, it was called Flemish paintings. I'd take these books out that were probably from the 60s, and a lot of them were in black and white, which was annoying. But you could still see that there was so much intention, and I didn't understand kind of the underpinnings of these societies at all. I would read what I could, but I was more interested in sort of how they were made. And they were often on wood, and that was interesting to me, too. But I looked at everything. I wasn't specifically Flemish painting. I looked at everything.
How did that early exposure influence how you thought about art?
I thought that it had to do something, and I think that is not how I feel now. I think that like what I thought was that these functional objects, which back then especially like cost so much money and also time and labor to make the materials, they had to do something and often had to be funded by someone to do that thing. And it wasn't, and this is not my objective either, to be expressive, but it was often with an end role that feels functional in a society. And I think it took a very long time to sort of unburden myself from that. And also why, when I was maybe like 30 or something, I never saw this work as being art necessarily, so much as like a sort of skill, something that had a function. And like, like paint someone's dog that died, and it'd be like, oh my God, this person had a real response to this because it's meaningful to them, and that was hugely gratifying, and also like not art in my mind.
Why?
I don't know. That's a good question. I just didn't. It didn't feel.
Conceptual enough, or?
Zero. I mean, I think that it's like no. I think it was just like making a perfect cocktail or making like a perfect meal or something. It had to do these things, and it's like, okay, it did the things. And yeah, I don't know. I think in the process of making something like that in that mind, so that you can totally daydream and do anything. It's not. It's more like, it's more of an artisanal activity.
Did growing up in a post-industrial town where nature was literally reclaiming what industry had left behind shape your sense of what nature was at that time?
Hugely, yeah. I mean, also society and like what capitalism was and like what globalization was, which I didn't know and encountered that when I went to school. But yeah, I mean, I lived in the kind of like ravaged aftermath of industry going into a place and then leaving, and that meant strip mines, but also old mines that had been sealed up that would open up and just consume someone's house. And then the kind of, my town was from 1901. It's very similar to many towns along these rivers that were all mill towns. And so there was an entitlement that people felt, I think, having had grandparents who had worked in situations that were very deadly to them, but which gave them a pension. And so that was this kind of like, I didn't grow up in that Denora. I grew up in a Denora that was 40 years after that. So, but I would go into buildings that were like, as if you'd stop time in the 30s. Like it just in fixtures, everything was like that. And there was a deep grudge that was talked about and felt by people there for not having the kind of lives that they felt entitled to by merit of their parents or grandparents living when they did. Many of whom all died of like lung cancers and stuff.
You have some paintings here of your grandmother, and they feel very conceptual in a lot of ways. Can you talk about the two pieces?
Well, this is my painting of my mother, actually.
Oh, okay.
But this is a painting of my grandmother. She did fall, and she did have a walker. Why she's in this space, I don't know. I think I was very, at that moment, looking at like a lot of surrealist paintings, and I love my grandmother, and you wouldn't necessarily know from that painting, but I painted her a lot, and she was very close. I was very close with her, and I took care of her garden, which was a little strip of like maybe a foot that surrounded her house because she was bedridden, and that got me very interested in planting things. But she was very old when I was born. Even she's from Puerto Rico, and she just was a character. So.
You've talked about feeling safest as you were growing up in the woods, places that weren't surveilled. Do you think your relationship to landscape began as a form of freedom?
I mean, I hadn't thought of that, but maybe. I mean, I think more than I was maybe seeking those spaces, I was escaping the people I was with, and the kind of scrutiny that was like unavoidable in those kinds of really hermetic situations.
At that stage of your life, you were planning on going into science.
Yeah.
What were you planning to do professionally at that point?
I don't really know. It just felt, I think, like something that, to my young mind, I believed, one, and two, that it felt exciting because whatever I was, it would have been something in natural sciences, but it would have been, in my ignorance, I thought that would be a space where there was like no ego. It's like, oh, like I could spend my whole life working at finding this thing, cracking this code, and then as I'm on my deathbed, some young person comes and does that, and I'd be happy about it. Like I thought it was just sort of like this kind of utopic alternative to man-made religions or something.
Your high school teacher arranged for you to attend an event with admissions officers from several college art programs, and this resulted in your being awarded a scholarship to go to Carnegie Mellon's prestigious undergraduate art program. And you said that when you got there, everyone else in the program had a baseline knowledge of art history, which you didn't have. What was that like for you? How did you catch up?
I didn't.
Or did you?
No, I didn't. I was totally confused by that. I mean, I didn't meet these people immediately. I just saw them because it's very communal. I saw people pulling out their portfolios saying, oh, we're presenting drawings of cones and cylinders and nudes and stuff. And I was like, what does this have to do with you? I just totally didn't get it. And then every single person had the same thing. And it was like, and I brought whatever I had there, which were these lots of drawings of all kinds of people, singers and that I care about and whatever, birds and whatever.
Were any of these paintings that we see behind us in that portfolio?
Probably this painting of Maria Callas, probably that bird. Yeah, probably just those two. But lots of drawings, and which I did all the time, and so, and which were very minute and like intense. But so many people rejected. They were like, really, were like, what is this? And I don't know. Anyway, it was really crazy happenstance because I arrived there and was just like, everyone was already queued up because you didn't have enough time really to go to every place you wanted. So you had to have also like a knowledge of where you'd want to go and get in a line that would take an hour. So since I didn't have that, I was standing there looking at this map of the Broom, and I was like, where do I even go? And these people came up and they were running late and they were throwing together like a little folding table, and they were panicked because they were there 15 minutes late. And I thought, well, I'll be the first person in line to these people. I don't know who they are. They didn't put the thing out. And it was Carnegie Mellon, which was weird because it was also from where I was. And this portfolio review day happened in Baltimore at MICA. And the person she looked at my sketchbook and started crying. And she's like...
She started to cry?
She started crying. She's like, where are you from? And she's like, Donora. And she's like, what are you doing here? And then she's like, if I gave you a scholarship, would you attend? And I was like, yeah. And
so she changed her life?
Like, in a second.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it was bananas. And then I had like an hour to kill, so I was like, I'll go to these other places, I guess. And really, I went in line with these places, and they were like, what is this? So it was very
Do you have a
super
sense of what made her cry?
I do, because I got to know her later, and she was the drawing chair. I mean, I should talk to her about it, and, well, one, that she recognized where that was in terms of, like, socioeconomic meaning, and you wouldn't unless you were from that region. And she also just, I think, knew that what I was making was not meant to cater to an acceptance committee. And it was like a thing I was making in the vacuum of my own child mind.
Yeah.
So,
It's incredible when adults reach out to people that they believe in, even when they might sense or know that the person themselves doesn't believe in what they're capable of. I ordinarily don't talk too much about myself in interviews with others, but there is somebody in the audience I want to acknowledge who I found out was coming today. Her name is Roz Goldfarb, and she changed my life back when I was in my early 30s and completely lost with nowhere to go, and she believed in me. And when we find people like that in our lives, I think it's important to acknowledge what that means. And
I love that happened.
Right?
Yeah. It's also, I've been the beneficiary of so many people like that in my
so
life.
thank you, Roz. In any case, I believe your family was disappointed that you weren't following their biblical beliefs.
I didn't ask them. I can surmise.
I mean, my father married a woman who was a Jehovah's Witness also, so I sense
Oh, yeah.
a little bit of what you, or I'm aware of what the sort of door-to-door situation was. My brothers had to do a lot of that with her.
Yeah.
How did you manage that?
It's not fun in the summer. I mean, it was, because also you were wearing like a cheap suit in like 100-degree weather.
Is that you there in that suit? That
Yep.
doesn't look like a cheap suit,
Yep.
though. That looks like a really dapper suit.
Well, what was the question exactly?
The question was, how did you manage the sense that your parents weren't approving where you were going?
These were not confidants of mine.
No?
Zero. No, absolutely not.
And so
they had they had no interest in me as a person like that. I was like I was a product of them, and that's. I think, my mother is alive and has really evolved since then, but my father did not evolve away from that. And and I think in so many of those kinds of environments, it's about power and control. And if you have a personality, that's a threat, and that I had a personality.
you've said that the amazing gift of your upbringing is that you have absolutely no problem telling someone to F off.
Yeah, I thank them for that.
And
that's where that
so
came from.
this is the tutorial moment of the interview. For all of us that might also have had challenging upbringings, can you share how you acquired this skill to do that?
I mean, it's a good question. I don't know exactly where that came from. Probably from my grandmother, to be absolutely real. I think, not too readily to tell someone to F off. But I think if it's obvious that they don't really have your interests at heart, as was so the case when I was a kid, they're asking for it. And also just like it's not, there's nothing at stake. They're not losing anything, actually.
But that really requires a belief in what you're capable of to sort of tell someone no.
Yeah, but you have to answer yourself at the end of the day, and I think, they didn't, it's wonderful to have been born, but you do the rest of the work. It's not, it's not someone else's job.
After graduating from Carnegie Mellon, you worked in video post-production. You also worked as an assistant to the feminist photographer and filmmaker Ellen Cantor, and as an archivist for the artist Vito Akansi. You then applied to MFA programs and attended Columbia University, which really surprised me. I mentioned that to you the other day. Why Columbia? I would have expected you to go to like a very famous art school for your MFA. I mean, not that Columbia's not famous. I just wouldn't have necessarily thought of it first and foremost for art.
I mean, to go back to this portfolio review day, like way back when I was a kid, and also, yeah, there was 7 years of doing all kinds of things. And part of what, I think part of what was so wildly off-putting about my undergraduate experience was that there was this idea that you are there to fit into an art historical continuum, and that is basically the same as starting any business or something, and having to be relevant or whatever. And that motivating drive for so many of the people I went to school with, if not all of them, made them spend huge amounts of money for student projects that looked like museum kind of incredible things they were making, and then they immediately stopped making work as soon as they graduated. And I think what I struggled with in that situation in undergraduate studies was that it was this kind of feedback loop where people were really like only interested in having a career, and so what was wonderful about being at Carnegie Mellon was that it was a university where I could take classes in other departments, and they actually force a sort of interdisciplinary relationship you have to choose if you're going to go to humanities and partner with them or science, and I actually went with humanities. And so when I was thinking about going to a graduate program, it was important to me to be like, I want to have access to other kind of coursework that will actually like not just be talking about what shows are happening wherever, and or what some theorist wrote about whatever. Like actually to have access to, like when I was at school, I studied with Kelly Jones, who was like an enormously influential person to me, and also studied in the anthropology department, and that enriched that experience immensely, and made me, it made me have a kind of multidimensional time there that I think many people, you wouldn't have, actually. You would not have that if you just had the coursework of your department.
How were those courses informing the subject matter of your painting?
Hugely, I mean, enormously. So all you had to do was like really write a professor, and that was as simple as getting a course catalog and seeing what looked interesting, their email would be there, and then because you're a grad student and they're not going to kick you out, you just write them and say, is it possible that I can be in your class as a sort of pass-fail thing? And they could say no. They usually said yes because they wanted different points of view, and if they didn't say yes, then you could at least audit it. And it felt like a huge waste of an incredible resource to not, I mean, Neil deGrasse Tyson is there, like you have this access to a crazy telescope, like whatever you were doing in your studio could have been enhanced, whatever it is, by someone on that campus. And it felt really, to not exploit that felt unwise.
These paintings they all feature nature, but they also include a figurative entity. Talk about the relationship that you had at this point in your work with a figure sort of embedded or participating or witnessing nature.
I mean, I think a lot of these paintings it's like the beginning of me moving away from drawing, and but yet many of these actually do have drawing as a sort of starting point. I allowed myself to deviate from that, but I remember that always being this kind of gear shift and being like, okay, throwing that away now, and like now it's becoming something else. And what you learn when you do that is that you immediately forget what you were so precious about, and then you're precious about something else. As far as people go in some of these paintings, like it was a bit it was absolutely out of this moment, which is the kind of rise of Black Lives Matter movement, and I had to kind of justify to myself what I was doing in the studio, if I'm going to be spending 10 hours a day painting or doing something else that's more, giving sort of more immediate, like protesting or whatever. And so I think I was very also interested in creating images that I hadn't seen exist in the world, and I think the more that I thought about, I think the language that was being bandied around at that time was really rattling around in my head, like matter, like what it does mean to matter and matter itself, and what constitutes that. So and also I was thinking about making images or paintings that were more than just an image, such that they would be singular and one to the next be very different. So these have different materials in them as a sort of way of seeing also how, on the few occasions where some of these were exhibited, how people addressed that, or how if they were forensically looking for, oh, there's diamonds there, or whatever this there, not diamonds, but milling diamonds used for machining. But how people assigned value to that kind of carbon and not the charcoal that it's underneath or the whatever is in it,
Susanna Coffey, a painter and your mentor from Columbia, once told you that when people see something they perceive as beautiful, it becomes difficult for them to unsee it.
She did say that.
Do you think that beauty can function as a veil?
As a what?
As a veil, as something to sort of obscure, the act of being beautiful obscures you from maybe what the topic matter is?
Yeah, maybe like a cloak.
Yeah, cloak,
And
better word.
And a dagger. I think that, I think she was saying it as a sort of inducement to deal with topics that otherwise would be, people can tune out or compartmentalize away. And I think what she meant by that, because it really stuck with me, and I love her, and she was really the first person, we'd go out night painting. She's the person who would go out and paint the moon over the Hudson. I think that she really believed in the power of painting as much as anything else, and wasn't just an image, that it had can have a certain kind of power. I think that exists in paint in a way that I don't hear people really talk about, but I think it is a real thing, that I make my paintings myself, and so a lot of people do have all kinds of people doing stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've been to many studios where there's a whole staff of people.
Most, and so, which is fine. That's making an image. I think when you're making a painting, though, it does have a kind of inherent I feel that way. You look at Rembrandt; they're made by teams of people, or Rubens or whatever. I think what I like most is looking at paintings that are made by a person, and where you can retrace the actual physicality of it, what they were bored at, and what they cared about, how they adjusted something, or how they maybe chose to crop an image after it was painted. To me, that is, at a human level, very interesting, and I think it felt dishonest to make work that didn't foreground that, and I think that is why it felt increasingly dishonest to make paintings that were having a drawing as an underpinning and being kind of dutifully executing it.
So now you place the paint directly on the canvas or the medium that you're working on, without a pre-drawing and without even a sense of necessarily what might occur?
Exactly. For better or worse.
It feels extremely dangerous.
But it's who said that? I forget who said it. Maybe Phil Guston or someone was it's not dangerous. Running and saving people out of buildings is dangerous.
Yeah, it's not dangerous for you.
Yeah, it's uncomfortable.
It might be for
certainly
all of us.
It's deeply uncomfortable, and it feels out of control. And for me, I'm a person, why I wanted to show those things at first is that is my tendency as a human being, is to have control, especially over an image. And I think particularly given where I kind of grew up, everything would have been so heavily scrutinized that it was a natural inclination to hide myself away from that and puppeteer an activity in a studio rather than showing up in a kind of a real way.
How do you navigate the tension between beauty and difficult histories in your work?
I don't ever think about beauty. I am actually shocked when people say that things are beautiful that I've made, but many I know are like, oh God. I don't think about beauty. I think about, I think not about much, actually, if I'm painting now. I think that what I do think about happens before I paint, and then when I'm working, something comes out of that, and then I have to identify it, I have to like reckon with it, I have to either, yeah, I follow it. When I was younger, I've been like, oh God, I'm gonna like yank this back to make it what I want it to be. And then what is that was coming out, you know, like that always happens, and I think that is also what was sort of at the crux of that is like to paint without a drawing. It's not actually dangerous in the way that you say, because even if you did paint on top of this drawing that you already laid out very meticulously with every kind of voice in your head from everyone who cares about you telling you like, "Oh, you made that?" Like, if you did that, you'd still have a second image. Like, there's what you're trying to do and then what you actually did do. And if you're even fussily trying to put paint down in an exact way, it's still communicating that you're a person who's probably out of control. Like, and you're trying to communicate that you are. So, like, why not just eliminate that step entirely and just be yourself? You know?
The exhibition, The Ecologies of Painting, invites us to look very closely at landscape, not as a backdrop, but as something alive and entangled with human history and labor and imagination. And the paintings remind us that nature has never been neutral, and it has been observed and shaped and idealized and controlled and sometimes resisted. When you look at the images in the exhibition, what do you see beneath the idealization?
I mean, that's the thing about that kind of work, is that I think to read it in the way that it was resonant in its time requires information, a lot of information, actually. I think I enjoy that. I enjoy, like, getting books and reading about what I'm looking at from bygone times. I think that those same, they're painted by human beings. I think what has really shifted hugely in terms of like what is painted or what people think of as worthy of being painted or whatever is the accessibility of materials. And and I think I was just even thinking about this conversation. I was like, painting, like what is painting? Like what is painting? And like, 17,000 years ago, that's when the Lascaux caves were painted. And it's like, we don't understand exactly how those images were resonant in that time. They still are, they're clearly meaningful for whoever made them. I don't think they lose value for not being able to decode them. I think I don't feel so arrogant as to think I understand like what situation produced the painting that I didn't make. Even myself, I'm like, what made this?
But the paintings, I think, in the exhibition, they ask us, they span centuries. Mm-hmm. So they ask us to consider not only how artists have depicted the natural world, but how those depictions shape our understanding of our place within it. How do you approach painting landscapes that have been mythologized as paradise?
Oh man, to be honest, like anything else, like I think if as a human being, not as a person painting, as a human being, if I'm puzzling something or if it matters to me in some kind of way, it's gonna be a thing I talk about. It's a thing that will probably come out in the studio, and it is not so contrived as to be like, I'm gonna do this thing that will change the way that this site is seen, and it just doesn't work like that. It would have when I was younger, where I think actually to use this like ugly word, I think that's where like art can become propaganda. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I really struggled as a young person to be like, so, like, who painted these religious, like, I want to look at these paintings at face value as just great artworks, but then there's also this underpinning of, like, who's funding them, the kind of actions of the church that maybe they're working for, and how the person making it wasn't even kind of seen in a good light by those churches.
Does that influence how you feel about a piece?
I think it can be a component. I think like not always, but I think I look at something, period, as no matter who made it, just like for what it is, for what I can see it to be, and that can be, you can sort of infer intention without knowing it. And I think if something, that's why outsider art, whatever the language is for calling that now, is so meaningful to people because it's made with intention and has value to the maker. And that is very immediately recognizable to me. What is harder is whenever the value is in the person funding the making. And then I usually just kind of appreciate it as a construction. And also, I think, but it adds complexity to appreciate the societal situation that produced that thing. I think a person who jumps to mind is like Goya or Velázquez, who were court painters, but also like creating images of society of people that were not able to buy their work, but they were also making very political, very intense, personal statements, for lack of a better word, in what they were making, while still painting the Duke of Wellington or whoever.
Mm-hmm. Drawing from personal geography, you traveled to Bermuda to understand your family's legacy, your father's legacy, to the Hudson Valley where you now live. Your work explores how place holds beauty and violence, presence and erasure. And your paintings are not simply representations of landscape, but meditations on memory, material, and the layered histories embedded in land itself. Do you think it's possible to depict landscape truthfully, or is every landscape in some way an invention?
I don't think there's a truth to any place. And I don't think of landscape as being distinguished from even the built environment, to be totally real. I think I was really thinking a lot about this for the show and for this conversation, what nature means to me, and it's really not like a thing outside of myself. It's not. I didn't move upstate to like find Arcadia. I moved there because it was like actually it was very close, and it was very, it allowed me to work without certain constraints that I felt impeded me, specifically like being observed, and also or having to come up with enough money to afford places that I would be working in, and for that need to sell stuff to afford the place that I'm working in. But having gone there, I recognized, as you do anywhere, that there are politics of a place that shape it, that shape conversations, that shape your treatment in the place. But that exists everywhere, and I think in the moment when I moved upstate, it was a question of like how to as readily and quickly understand the texture of these places and what are the stakes, why do these people care about this issue, and that is for my own self-preservation, but also to be like, how am I implicated in this? What is my impact as a person who's coming into this place? If I go and tell people I'm in this town, is that going to just completely like destroy a lot of positive things about the town? And it surely would have. I think I moved through the world curious about that, and I think of it as always evolving in ways that are positive, negative, and neutral.
You've talked about having to find ways into museums when you were younger. We're having this conversation today, now, in a museum that since 2023 holds one of your paintings in its permanent collection. An institution that, like the landscapes you paint, is itself a site of history and access and transformation. What do you imagine your painting being in dialogue with the other paintings here being?
I mean, it's sort of proof of having existed, which is interesting and profound. I didn't make this work right before it was acquired by the museum. It was in my life for like a year before I even showed it. And it's of a site at my studio, of literally paths that I cut into a meadow that I didn't really know what I was painting when I was working on it, but then the more I looked at it, which is why I was in my studio for a year, I felt that it was probably, because the time when it was made, about agency and making choices, and also the kind of magic that historically happens at crossroads. And I don't feel like that is not necessary information for people to like have their experience with that work, but I think what is really amazing about the Met, what's incredibly amazing about the Met, and apropos of this conversation particularly, is like, this is a free museum, and so few are in the world, and this houses some of the most incredible things to just feed your imagination and curiosity, and to be able to do that so readily, why would you not be here all the time? And so I was here all the time. And what happens and what's interesting about painting to me is that whatever you put in does go into this kind of under realm of the subconscious and comes out in all kinds of ways. And as we were talking to Anna Claire, I believe that like when I was working on this painting, that some part of my brain remembered that Bruegel painting, and actually that cut into the wheat field, which struck me as like like a very strange, cool choice. It sort of punctures the way that you see the painting, and I was not thinking about that in this painting here, but I think that all those things just end up informing decisions you make, and only later you're like, oh, like, did I just repaint someone else's painting? So yeah, it's an incredible, it's like hard to put into words what it is to be at this museum, but it feels like my home, like a sort of cultural home in lots of ways.
And you don't have to sneak in anymore.
I don't have to sneak in anymore. No, it's yeah, this is my favorite place in New York, so it's crazy.
I have two last questions for you. You have a painting here in one of the most, if not the most famous museum in the world. You're represented by the Gagosian Gallery. Your work is in important collections in museums. You've even designed the carpet and some of the ephemera for last year's Met Gala. Really, truly. Does success impact the way you approach your practice?
No, not zero.
No?
No.
Do you feel pressure to live up to anything
No.
specific?
No. Like,
How do you keep that aside?
I front-loaded my life that way. I was just like, I'm not doing this again. I had very hard conversations with gallerists that I worked with years and years ago about that, and it meant that no one goes in my studio. It's my space, and that is probably unique a bit. Like, people don't go to my studio. So not only can that now pick up something that's half done and say, I want to sell that, or like, stop, it's done. Don't put another, it's like you don't know what you're looking at, so I don't either. I don't either, but you certainly don't. So for me, like, that has meant like huge freedom, and I think certainly probably meant that certain opportunities were not afforded to me because I was not having people in my studio in the same way, and I was not allowing them to ever say, like, do that again. Mm-hmm. The moment someone ever said anything along those lines, I would just be like, and have a conversation about it. If they did it twice, there's a problem. So, I think many people I know have been intimidated into behavior because of that kind of pressure,
Yeah.
and I think it is very important to not yield to it.
My last question is actually, I think, more of a gift for us all. Tell us about what you're working on now, and I know you have a slide to show us, despite you not letting people into your studio. You're letting us in.
That is true.
So look at this
And it's not done.
magnificence on the wall here for everyone to see. Talk about what you're making now.
I don't know if I can. I took this picture literally last night. It felt just honest to be doing that. I think that's the same spirit of putting like childhood paintings in. It's like, this is what it happens to be. I'm looking at this and working on it in real time. I think it probably came out of, the painting that was previous to this is of the Delaware River frozen, and where I was going there and drawing, or painting the river. But then it melted, so maybe this is probably the algae that's underneath that I've been looking at. Probably. I mean, I don't know. I'm actually like, when I'm working, I always like photograph where I stop and then go to dinner and then like look at what I did and I'm like, what is this? And really, that's how I just like work all day, and then I'm like, and I just won't look at it until then, and especially if I'm hungry, it's very hard to even see it. And then, it takes a long time to sort of ascertain what even something is.
Well, thank you for sharing this with us. I feel very
Thank you for looking.
privileged to get this sort of
That's
very, very exclusive peek under the hood.
Thank you for being an artist.
Cy Gavin, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. And
for
thank you
coming.
to everybody at the Met for making this happen.
Well, thank you.